All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling something, well, pretty close to home for, I think, a lot of us. It's about how we feel about our bodies, and how that ties into what we think makes us attractive, especially when it comes to dating and relationships.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
Well,
who hasn't felt that kind of pressure?
right. So we've got some really interesting research to dig into. It's all about this idea called attractiveness contingent self-esteem, which we'll definitely unpack because it's a bit of a mouthful. But basically, the research looks at how this ACSE thing connects with a woman's body image, especially when she experiences, romantic rejection.
And that can be a pretty sensitive topic.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
what we're really trying to understand here is who is most affected by these kind of societal beauty standards that are always kind of floating around? And, when do those standards really start to have an impact on how we feel about ourselves, in those moments when we're maybe feeling a bit vulnerable?
Exactly. And the mission here is to really understand who is most susceptible to those messages, to feeling pressured by what society says is attractive, and especially to figure out what are the times when that pressure, those standards, really start to affect how a woman sees her own body. And we're not just talking about a fleeting thought after a bad date. This is deeper than that, right? It's about how those beliefs about attractiveness actually become part of how you see your own body.
Okay, so let's get into it. One of the first things the research points out is just how central the idea of attractiveness is for women in Western cultures. It's almost as if there's this constant evaluation happening, even if it's not always spoken out loud.
Right. The research really emphasizes that point, how often women are judged or, evaluated based purely on looks. And unfortunately, a lot of women kind of internalize that message. So it gets to a point where you start judging your own self-worth based on how attractive you think you are.
And that has some pretty serious consequences, doesn't it? Like the research even found that compared to men, women experience a much bigger drop in their self-esteem when they get negative feedback about their looks. That's got to hurt.
It does. And to make matters worse, it has a snowball effect. So if you're already feeling bad about your attractiveness, how you see yourself, it can really feed into that bigger problem of body dissatisfaction. And that can be a huge problem because the research is really clear that body dissatisfaction is linked to so many other issues, like a lower quality of life overall, a higher risk of depression and anxiety, and even a greater chance of developing, eating disorders.
It's pretty sobering.
Yeah.
And the research also makes it clear that this isn't just something teenage girls deal with, right? It can affect women at any age, even those who, have what's considered a healthy weight. It's really more about how you see yourself, and that can be hard to shake.
Exactly. It can be a lifelong struggle. And this is where this concept of attractiveness contingent self-esteem, or ACSE, comes in.
Okay, so what exactly is ACSE? The research talks about contingent self-esteem in general first. Like, what's that all about?
So the basic idea behind contingent self-esteem is that your sense of worth, how much you value yourself, isn't fixed. Instead, it's like contingent on whether you meet certain standards or expectations that you've, internalized over time.
Yeah.
So if you reach those standards, your self-esteem goes up. But if you don't, well, it takes a hit.
Ah, okay, so it's like conditional self-esteem. And ACSE is just a specific type of that, but it's all about attractiveness. So if you have high ACSE, what does that actually look like?
It means that for you, your self-esteem goes up and down depending on how well you think you measure up in terms of attractiveness, both your own standards and, crucially, what you think other people find attractive.
I see. So you're always kind of second-guessing yourself, wondering if you're attractive enough. And the research did find a pretty clear link, right? Like women who score higher on this ACSE tend to be way more preoccupied with their appearance, right?
Yeah, it makes sense. If a big chunk of how you feel about yourself depends on being attractive, you're going to spend a lot of time and energy trying to meet those standards. And what's interesting is that all that focus on appearance actually leads to greater body dissatisfaction because you're constantly evaluating yourself against these, sometimes impossible standards, and it's easy to come up short.
That's the key point the research is making. It's not just that someone have low self-esteem in general. This ACSE is a separate factor that can really mess with how you see your body.
Right. And that's really important to understand because you could have someone who's generally pretty confident, but if a huge part of their self-esteem is tied to their attractiveness, if they have high ACSE, they're still going to be vulnerable to feeling bad about their body, especially in situations where they feel like their attractiveness is being judged, like, if they get rejected romantically.
Okay, so that brings us to the next big piece of this puzzle, romantic rejection. The research highlights how significant that can be for someone with high ACSE. why is that? Like, why is romantic rejection such a big deal when we're talking about attractiveness specifically?
Well, think about it. Attractiveness is often a major factor in that initial spark of romantic interest. It's like how someone looks can be a huge part of whether you want to get to know them better, especially in those early stages of dating, even just looking at someone's profile picture.
Yeah, we all do it. So if attractiveness is that important for attracting someone, then what happens when you get rejected?
Well, it's easy to take it personally. You might start thinking, maybe I wasn't attractive enough for them, and that can really sting, especially if your self-esteem is riding on how attractive you feel.
And the research suggests that women might be especially sensitive to that kind of rejection. Why is that?
Well, there are a few things going on. First, there's this huge emphasis in our culture on women's physical attractiveness, especially when it comes to dating and relationships. And second, like we've been talking about, women are often more likely to base their self-worth on their looks. So romantic rejection can feel like it's confirming those deepest fears, those worries that you're not good enough. Like all those insecurities you've had about your looks are suddenly validated.
It's like a punch in the gut. And there was even some earlier research that kind of hinted at this, right? Like they found that romantic rejection could lead to lower self-esteem and make women feel less desirable overall. Like they had less mate value.
Right. So you've got this ACSE thing where your self-esteem is tied up in being attractive, and then you get hit with romantic rejection, which feels like a direct attack on that. It all starts to make sense.
So that's where this new research comes in, right? They wanted to look at how these two things, ACSE and romantic rejection, actually interact and impact body dissatisfaction. And the first study they did focused on how women remember past rejections.
Yeah, so in study one, they had a group of women, not just college students, but, women from different ages and backgrounds, think back to a time when they experienced romantic rejection. Then they had them report on how dissatisfied they felt with their bodies during that experience.
And what did they find? Like, did those women who had higher ACSE really feel worse about their bodies when they recalled being rejected?
That's exactly what they found. The women who scored higher in ACSE reported significantly more body dissatisfaction when thinking back on those romantic rejections. It's like those rejections really hit them harder because their sense of self-worth was so tied up in their attractiveness.
But they also took into account other things too, right? Like maybe someone had just been rejected a bunch of times, or maybe it was like a really long time ago.
Yeah, they definitely wanted to make sure they weren't missing something obvious. So they did consider how many times each woman had been rejected and how much time had passed since, a really significant rejection experience. But here's the thing, that link between high ACSE and feeling worse about your body after rejection, it was still there. Even after accounting for those other factors, that connection was really strong.
That's pretty powerful stuff. But remembering past events can be tricky, right? Our memories aren't always perfect.
Yes.
So that's where the second study comes in. They wanted to look at these experiences in real time. How did that work?
Right. So for study two, they had a group of college women keep a daily diary for 10 days. Every day they would write down any instances of romantic rejection they experienced, even small things, and also rate how they felt about their bodies that day.
So a much more in-the-moment kind of snapshot of how they were feeling. Did they find the same thing?
Yeah, they did. Study two basically confirmed what they saw in the first study, but it added a whole new level of detail. What they found was that, for those women with high ACSE, their body dissatisfaction would spike on the days when they experienced more romantic rejection. It wasn't just a general feeling, it was directly tied to those specific days.
They called this the within-person effect, which is kind of a technical term. What does that actually mean for, someone listening?
Basically, it means that they were observing changes within each individual woman. So on the days when a woman was experiencing more romantic rejection than usual for her, her body dissatisfaction would increase. And this was especially pronounced for those with high ACSE. It really highlights how these two things are connected, how rejection can trigger these negative feelings about your body, especially if your self-esteem is already tied up in how attractive you think you are.
And they also took into account general self-esteem again, right? Like in the first study.
Yep. And once again, that effect of ACSE on body dissatisfaction after rejection, it was independent of a woman's overall self-esteem. So it wasn't just that women who generally felt bad about themselves were more affected. It was specifically those whose self-esteem was really contingent on their attractiveness. They were the ones who really took a hit after those rejections.
Okay, so this all makes sense so far. But the researchers also mentioned another study which had a kind of unexpected result. It showed that in some cases, non-romantic rejection actually led to increased body satisfaction. But here's the catch. This only happened for women whose self-worth was tied to their weight. How does that fit in with what we've been talking about? It seems kind of contradictory.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The researchers think the key difference might be the type of rejection. Romantic rejection, like we talked about, it's often perceived as a comment on your attractiveness directly. It's like you're not attractive enough for someone to want to date you. But non-romantic rejection, like not getting picked for a team or something, well, that could be because of your skills or your personality, things that aren't as directly related to your appearance.
So it's about whether the rejection feels like a personal attack on the thing your self-esteem is based on. If you're someone whose self-worth is tied to your weight, then getting rejected romantically feels like a direct hit to your attractiveness, right? But getting passed over for a promotion, well, that might sting, but it's not necessarily a comment on your looks.
Exactly. And that could explain why, in that other study, women whose self-esteem was tied to their weight actually felt better about their bodies after non-romantic rejection. It's like a defense mechanism, a way to feel good about yourself when another aspect of you is being criticized. But when it's romantic rejection, it's like a direct threat to your attractiveness. So that kind of boost to your body image is less likely to happen, especially if you've got high ACSE.
So what does all of this mean for us? What are the big takeaways from this research?
Well, first of all, it's pretty clear that high ACSE is a risk factor for body dissatisfaction, especially when you find yourself in situations where your attractiveness is being evaluated. And romantic rejection is a classic example of that. It's not just about feeling bummed out. It can actually make you feel worse about your body if you're already sensitive to those kinds of judgments.
And I'm sure there are other situations that can have the same effect, right? The research talked about things like fat talk or getting negative comments from friends about your appearance.
Absolutely. It's really any situation where you feel like you're being judged or compared negatively to others, especially when it comes to your looks. It could even be something as simple as scrolling through social media and seeing all those, perfect bodies. It's really easy to start comparing yourself and feeling inadequate, especially if your self-esteem is riding on how attractive you think you are.
And the researchers also touched on how this could affect other areas of your life too, right? Like your sex life and your overall sense of worth.
Right, because how you feel about your body is so connected to everything else. If you're feeling bad about your body, if your body dissatisfaction is constantly getting triggered by these experiences of rejection, it can start to affect how you feel about yourself in intimate situations and relationships, and even just in general. It can really start to chip away at your confidence and self-esteem.
So how can we actually use this information to help people, especially women, feel better about their bodies?
The researchers suggest that we need to start targeting ACSE specifically. Instead of just trying to boost overall self-esteem, we need to help people uncouple their sense of worth from their attractiveness. It's about challenging that belief that your value as a person is tied to how you look.
And they also pointed out that there's still a lot more research to be done in this area. What are some of the questions they think we still need to answer?
Well, one thing they mentioned is doing longitudinal studies. That would mean following people over a longer period of time to see how high ACSE and repeated experiences of romantic rejection affect body image in the long run. It would also be really interesting to do experiments where rejection is manipulated in a controlled setting. That way we could see if there's a direct cause and effect relationship between rejection and body dissatisfaction. They also mentioned exploring the role of self-affirmation. Like, can we use self-affirmation techniques to help people buffer themselves against these negative effects of rejection? And finally, it would be really interesting to see if the same things are happening in men, maybe with different factors playing a role. Like maybe men's self-esteem is more tied to their status or their achievements. It would be fascinating to see how those things play out in the context of rejection.
So what we've learned today is that for women whose self-esteem is really tied to their attractiveness, romantic rejection can be a really tough thing to deal with. It can trigger all sorts of negative feelings about their bodies. And it's not just about feeling a bit insecure. It's about having this really core part of your identity challenged and feeling like you've come up short.
And it's important to remember on the days when those women weren't experiencing a lot of rejection, the researchers didn't see a significant difference in body satisfaction between those with high and low ACSE. It's really the rejection that brings that vulnerability to the forefront.
This all really makes you think, doesn't it? About all the messages we're bombarded with about how important attractiveness is. And for you, our listener, I want you to think about all the different situations in your own life and in the lives of the people you know where attractiveness is really emphasized. How might those situations be shaping how you see yourself?
And that leads to an even bigger question. What is your own self-esteem based on? Is it heavily dependent on what other people think, especially when it comes to your looks? And if so, is there anything you can do to build a more solid sense of self-worth? One that isn't so easily swayed by other people's opinions? That's something worth thinking about.
Yeah, it really is. Understanding these dynamics could be incredibly powerful. It's about learning to accept yourself for who you are and not letting those external pressures dictate how you feel about your body. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive today. I hope it's given you some things to think about.
It's been great exploring this research with you.